My friends, let us come together for a moment in that inner quiet where truth is felt rather than reasoned. For in the silence of our being, we touch the essence of the message that has echoed across the centuries, a message spoken in three simple words upon the cross. It is finished. And yet, though these words have been repeated by millions, their spiritual meaning remains largely veiled, hidden not by any design of God, but by our insistence on interpreting them through the limited lens of human thought. When Jesus uttered that statement, he was not declaring an end to life. He was revealing something far more profound, the eternal completeness of God's creation. He was announcing the end of the human belief that we stand apart from our source, the end of the sense of struggle, the end of the illusion that we must make ourselves worthy or whole. He was giving voice to the truth that spiritual fulfillment is not a distant attainment, not a reward for future effort, but a present reality awaiting our recognition. You see, the spiritual path is not the journey of becoming, but the gentle awakening to what already is. The work of God is finished. The harmony, the abundance, the wholeness, the peace, all of it stands completed in the infinite. Our task is not to add to creation, nor to improve it, nor to repair it, but to behold it. And so we begin not with striving, but with rest, not with petition, but with recognition, not with effort, but with awareness. Today, we will explore what truly occurs within us when we no longer attempt to make truth happen through human will and instead accept that truth already exists in spiritual reality. We will discover how consciousness shifts when it ceases to wrestle with appearances and learns to dwell in the presence behind them. And as this unfolds gently within you, you will begin to understand why Jesus could speak those words with such authority, because he was not speaking from the level of the world, but from the consciousness of the Christ, in which nothing is incomplete. Let us enter this study with a willingness to set aside all belief in personal achievement. Let us approach it not as seekers, but as those who are remembering, for the truth is not gained, it is recognized. And as we recognize even a measure of the finished nature of God's work, something within us begins to soften, to yield, to rest. It is this inner shift that opens the way for the fuller revelation to appear. This is where our journey begins. Now let us look a little more deeply into the spiritual meaning of this statement. It is finished. For unless we grasp the principle behind it, we cannot hope to live it, nor can we understand the transformation it brings. In the human sense of life, everything appears to be in a state of becoming. We believe that health must be achieved, that supply must be earned, that harmony must be created. We believe that we are moving from imperfection toward perfection, from lack toward abundance, from fear toward peace. And so the world becomes a continual process of effort, of striving, of reaching for that which always seems just beyond our grasp. But in spiritual consciousness, nothing is becoming. Everything simply is. For God, being infinite, cannot evolve. God cannot grow. God cannot add to himself. And if God cannot evolve or grow, then his creation, being the expression of his own nature, also cannot evolve or grow. It stands complete, whole, finished, radiant in its perfection. This is the truth Jesus beheld when he declared, "It is finished." He was speaking from the standpoint of spiritual vision, the Christ mind, in which creation is seen not as a process, but as a fullness already accomplished. He was not referring to a moment in time. He was revealing an eternal state of being. You and I, viewing life through the lens of the human mind, see incompleteness everywhere. We see problems to solve, conditions to fix, deficits to overcome, But these are the shadows cast by our limited perception. They do not constitute spiritual reality. Spiritual reality remains untouched, unaltered, unblemished, because it is the activity of God, and the activity of God cannot be hindered, cannot be diminished, cannot be undone. When we begin to sense, even faintly, that the truth of our being exists already in its finished state, we start to loosen our grip on the belief that we must make life work. We begin to understand that our function is not to complete anything, but to witness what God has already completed. And in that witnessing, the nature of our experience begins to change. So long as we insist on living from the premise that something is missing, we remain bound to the realm of striving. But when we touch, even for a moment, the awareness that nothing is missing in God, and therefore nothing can be missing in the truth of our being, we shift from the human sense of life into spiritual consciousness. And it is this shift, gentle yet profound, that reveals what Jesus knew so completely, that the work of God is finished, perfect, eternal, and universal. Let us rest in that realization for a moment, not as doctrine, not as belief, but as truth. For the more deeply we comprehend this principle, the more naturally our inner life begins to align with the kingdom that is always present, always complete, always finished. Let us look now at one of the great obstacles on the spiritual path, an obstacle so subtle that even sincere students stumble over it repeatedly. The belief that through striving, through effort, through the exertion of the human mind, we can attain spiritual realization. This belief is the very heart of the illusion from which Jesus sought to free humanity. For what is striving but the conviction that something is lacking? And what is effort but the attempt of a personal sense of self to secure what it believes it does not yet possess? But you see, my friends, the moment we engage in striving, we are functioning from the standpoint of separation. We imagine ourselves cut off from the source of our being, left to our own devices to achieve peace, supply, healing, or harmony. And in that moment, we have stepped out of the awareness of God's completeness and into the dream of personal responsibility. We begin to live as if the weight of our entire existence rests upon our shoulders, and from that position, fear is inevitable. Most spiritual effort fails not because the student lacks discipline or sincerity, but because the effort itself arises from a false premise. If we believe that God's work is unfinished, then of course we will try to complete it. If we believe that God is withholding something, then naturally we will try to obtain it. And if we believe that God is far away, then we will strive endlessly to reach him. But none of these beliefs are true, and therefore none of the actions that spring from them can bear the fruit of truth. In the infinite way, we do not seek to compel God to act, nor do we attempt to superimpose spiritual truth upon material conditions. Rather, we learn to relinquish the belief that conditions possess power at all. We learn to let go of the idea that our thoughts, our emotions, or our personal will can bring about spiritual demonstration. For spiritual realization does not come from human effort, it comes from the dawning of awareness. When we strive, we are attempting to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, as though the personal self, the very thing that is unreal, could become the instrument of spiritual attainment. But the personal self cannot enter the kingdom of God, and no amount of effort will transform it into the Christ. Striving keeps us rooted in the belief that we are separate individuals, seeking something outside ourselves. Recognition reveals that we are expressions of the one divine self, in whom all is already complete. It is a strange paradox. The harder one tries to achieve spiritual fulfillment, the more elusive it becomes. The moment we stop trying, The moment we release the belief that we must do something to attain God, the presence of God begins to reveal itself, not because we have earned it, but because we have ceased resisting it. You do not enter the kingdom through striving. You enter by surrendering the belief that there is any distance to cross. You enter by yielding the personal sense of life and resting in the truth that spiritual reality is not created by your effort, it is recognized by your stillness. This is the shift from human striving to spiritual awareness, and it marks the beginning of true transformation. Let us now consider what takes place within us when we begin to respond to life, not from the human sense of mind, but from the quiet recognition of spiritual truth. For this is the turning point on the path, the moment when the center of our consciousness shifts and we no longer live as though we are separate beings struggling to align ourselves with God, but as expressions of the one presence revealing itself. The first change is not dramatic. It is not a burst of light, nor an overwhelming experience. Rather, it is a softening, an easing of the inner tension we have carried for so long. The human mind, accustomed to constant vigilance, to controlling, to analyzing, to protecting itself, begins to relax. It no longer stands guard over every circumstance. It no longer assumes that it must interpret, judge, or manage each appearance that presents itself. A certain quiet confidence begins to dawn, not in our personal capacity, but in the completeness of God. This is the beginning of the Christ mind, the mind that does not react to appearances, but beholds the truth behind them. The Christ mind is not a superior intellect. It is the capacity to see with spiritual vision, to recognize that what the eyes and ears report is not the final word. It is the awareness that life, real life, is unfolding from within, and that nothing external has authority over the truth of our being. And as this recognition awakens within you, your perception changes. You may still see a discordant condition, but you no longer interpret it as a power. You no longer accept it as a reality. Instead, you stand inwardly still and listen for the assurance that spiritual reality is untouched. You begin to sense that behind every appearance, whether it be illness, lack, conflict, or fear, there exists a spiritual perfection already established, waiting only for your recognition. This does not mean you deny what the senses present. It means you cease granting them authority. You see the appearance, but you no longer fear it. You acknowledge the condition, but you are not governed by it. You become aware of something deeper, a presence that accompanies you, a peace that requires no outer circumstance to justify it, a stillness that is not affected by the movements of the world. The Christ mind reveals itself not through visions or sensations, but through the simple knowing that God is the only reality and that nothing exists outside of God. When this knowing begins to dawn not as belief, not as theory, but as inner experience, the entire fabric of life subtly shifts. You find that you move more gently, speak more quietly, respond more patiently. You discover that you need not defend yourself, nor justify yourself, nor protect yourself, for your life is no longer resting in personal strength but in the assurance of the infinite. This shift cannot be forced, nor can it be manufactured. It unfolds naturally as we cease striving and begin resting in the truth that the spiritual creation is finished. The human mind seeks solutions. The Christ mind beholds truth. The human mind reacts. The Christ mind rests. The human mind tries to make things happen. The Christ mind witnesses what already is. And so the transformation begins not with outward change, but with the quiet dawning of a new inward standpoint. the recognition that we are no longer living life through the limited lens of human perception, but through the consciousness that Jesus revealed, the consciousness in which lack dissolves, fear loses its foundation, and harmony flows effortlessly because it is already established in God. This is the shift from human mind to Christ mind. It is gentle, but it is the most profound change that can occur within an individual. As this inner shift begins to unfold, this movement from the human sense of mind to the Christ mind, you will notice something remarkable. Your relationship to the problems and circumstances of daily living starts to change. Not because the external conditions have yet transformed, but because you have changed. Your consciousness has been touched by the awareness that spiritual reality is already complete. And from this standpoint, the entire meaning of a problem is altered. In the human sense of life, a problem is something we must confront, resist, solve, or overcome. We see it as an external force acting upon us, demanding response and often producing fear. But in spiritual consciousness, a problem is nothing more than an appearance without substance, without power, without spiritual law to sustain it. It is a shadow cast by the belief in separation, and when that belief begins to dissolve, the shadow loses its authority. This does not mean that difficulties will never arise in our experience. They may appear, just as clouds may pass before the sun. But as the sun is unaffected by the clouds, so the spiritual reality of your being remains untouched by the passing conditions of the world. The difference is that now you no longer treat the cloud as a power. When a financial difficulty arises, you do not rush into panic or frantic effort. You do not plead with God, for you have learned that God does not withhold supply. Instead, you pause, you rest. You let the truth of God's infinite abundance fill your consciousness. You recognize that supply is not something to be attained, but something that already exists in the invisible, and that your recognition of it opens the way for its appearing in the visible. When a physical condition presents itself, you no longer fight it as though it had independent authority. You know it is an appearance based on the limited perception of the human mind. You acknowledge it, but you do not accept it as truth. You turn inward to the awareness of the one, life that cannot be sick, cannot be impaired, cannot be diminished, and in that inner knowing, the fear that once accompanied illness begins to dissolve. When there is discord in relationships, you no longer attempt to manipulate, correct, or control other individuals. You understand that the only relationship that truly exists is the relationship between God and His expression. Therefore, harmony is already established. Your task is simply to recognize that harmony, to rest in it, and to behold its unfoldment. You see, the outer actions may still take place. You may still make a phone call, see a physician, or have a conversation, but the spirit behind these actions has changed. They no longer arise from fear or urgency. They arise from peace. And actions taken from peace are guided, harmonious, and effective, because they are not born of the human will, but of the wisdom of the Christ within. This is the great secret. When the burden is lifted from your shoulders and placed where it belongs in the realization of God's completed work, you discover that the very conditions which once overwhelmed you now yield to the presence of truth, not by your effort, but by your non-resistance. Not because you have controlled life, but because you have allowed life to be what it already is. And so, your relationship to circumstances changes entirely. Problems no longer dominate you. They no longer define you. They no longer frighten you. They are seen for what they are, appearances that arise and dissolve within the field of consciousness, having no more reality than dreams upon waking. This is the freedom that begins to unfold when you live from the awareness that it is finished. Let us now explore how we may live this truth in practical terms, not as a theory, not as an inspiring concept, but as a daily, moment-by-moment way of being. For the kingdom of God is not attained through effort, nor entered through ritual. It is realized through recognition. And recognition, my friends, is a practice, not a technique or method, but a gentle returning of the mind to the awareness of what already is. When an appearance confronts you, an appearance of lack, an appearance of disease, an appearance of discord, the natural tendency of the human mind is to react. It rushes forward. It seeks solutions, makes plans, issues, judgments, but the first step in spiritual practice is to pause, to become still, to withhold reaction, not through force or discipline, but through the understanding that reaction itself is the acceptance of the appearance as power. In that pause, you turn inward, not to ask for God's help, not to plead for correction, but simply to acknowledge, in God's reality, this is already complete. In God's reality, nothing needs to be changed. In God's reality, the fullness of being is already established. This is not spoken as affirmation. It is recognized as truth. You are not trying to make it true. You are remembering that it already is true. And so you rest, not in passivity, but in awareness. You rest in the assurance that the invisible spiritual kingdom is intact, unbroken, whole. You rest in the understanding that all that God is present here. Where the appearance seems to be, you rest because the burden is not yours. You rest because the work is finished. Now, this practice may take only a moment, or it may take many moments. It may take silence. It may take returning again and again to the same simple recognition, and that is perfectly all right, for the purpose of the practice is not to change the condition, but to change your consciousness about the condition. As consciousness changes, the outer picture adjusts of its own accord. Some students say, but I do not feel the truth when I acknowledge it. And I tell them, feeling is not required at the beginning. Recognition precedes feeling. First, the truth is acknowledged. Then the consciousness shifts. Then the feeling follows. Just as the dawn precedes the sunrise, recognition precedes realization. This is why Goldsmith often spoke of keeping your mind stayed on God, not as a mental exercise, but as a continual resting in the awareness of the presence. It is the habit of turning within again and again until the within becomes more real to you than the without, until the truth becomes more compelling than the appearance, until the finished nature of God's work becomes the lens through which all of life is seen. In time, this practice becomes natural. You will no longer have to pause deliberately, for the pause will arise spontaneously. You will no longer have to remind yourself that God's work is finished, for that recognition will be the ground upon which your consciousness stands. And when this happens, you will discover that appearances lose their power to disturb you. They may come and they may go, but you remain anchored in the awareness that behind every appearance is the eternal reality of God's completeness. Living from the finished kingdom is not a matter of effort. It is the gentle discipline of remembrance, the remembrance that nothing can be added to the perfection of God and nothing can be taken from it. The remembrance that all good is already established in the invisible, the remembrance that your life is the expression of God and therefore the fullness of God must appear as your experience when you are still enough to behold it. This, then, is the practice of recognition. It is the foundation upon which the entire spiritual life rests. As you continue in this practice of recognition, this gentle turning toward the truth that God's work is already finished, you will begin to notice a transformation occurring within you. It is not sudden, it is not dramatic, it does not announce itself with fanfare. Rather, it unfolds quietly, like the way dawn breaks upon the earth, almost imperceptibly at first, until you realize the night is gone. The first of these transformations is the gradual dissolving of fear. Fear, you see, is always based on the belief that something real can be taken from you, or that something necessary can be withheld. But when your consciousness becomes rooted in the understanding that God's universe is complete and that you live and move in that universe, the very foundation of fear begins to crumble. Not because you have battled fear, not because you have argued with it, but because you have withdrawn your belief in the conditions that give fear its seeming power. You may notice that situations which once would have caused anxiety now elicit a calmer response. You may find that you are no longer anticipating disaster, no longer preparing for the worst, no longer carrying the inner tension that once accompanied uncertainty. Fear fades, not by conquest, but by recognition that God's completeness is the only reality. As fear dissolves, so too does the sense of lack. Lack exists only in the consciousness that believes itself separate from the infinite source of supply. But when you begin to live with the awareness that supply is not created by human effort but flows from the eternal nature of God, the idea of lack becomes foreign to you. You discover that your needs are met in ways you could not have planned or orchestrated, not through striving, but through alignment, not through demanding, but through resting in the truth that God's abundance is always present, always available, always flowing. This does not mean you will suddenly have everything the human mind desires. It means you will have what the divine plan for your life requires. You will find that what comes to you is appropriate, harmonious, and sufficient, because it comes not as a result of personal striving, but as the natural outflow of spiritual completeness. And as fear and lack lose their hold, something else begins to dissolve: resistance. Resistance is the belief that life should be other than it is. It is the inner tension that arises when we oppose the appearance, when we fight against conditions, when we refuse to accept what is unfolding. But when you understand that every appearance is but a shadow of a deeper spiritual reality, you no longer resist. You allow everything to come and go without clinging, without fear, without judgment. This is not resignation. It is not passivity. It is trust, the trust that the intelligence of the Christ within you is guiding your life perfectly. It is the recognition that nothing real can oppose God, and therefore nothing unreal needs to be resisted. You begin to flow with life rather than against it, and in that flow there is great peace. This process, this dissolving of fear, lack, and resistance is not something you accomplish. It happens naturally as you rest more consistently in the truth that it is finished. The old patterns dissolve like mist before the sun, not because you have worked to eradicate them, but because your consciousness has shifted to a higher standpoint. And so, each day, without effort, you find that you are living with greater ease, greater trust, greater stillness. You are no longer buffeted by the storms of the world, for your anchor is not in the world. It is in the infinite completeness of God, already established, already present, already finished. This is the quiet miracle that begins to unfold when you live from the spiritual fact rather than the human appearance. Now we come to one of the most sacred unfoldments that occurs when one begins to live from the consciousness of the finished kingdom. As fear dissolves, as lack loses its hold, as resistance melts away, something far deeper begins to emerge: your true identity. The identity that has always been present but long obscured by the belief in separation. You see, the human sense of self is built upon the conviction that we are finite creatures, born into limitation, confined to personal strength, dependent upon external conditions. But this concept of self is nothing more than a mental image, a collection of memories, opinions, and beliefs that we have come to accept as me. It has no spiritual substance, no permanence, no divine authority. As the light of recognition begins to dawn, this constructed self gradually loses its reality for you. You realize that you are not the mind that thinks, nor the emotions that fluctuate, nor the body that appears to age. You are not the personality with its preferences, its habits, its history. These belong to the realm of appearance, not to the truth of your being. What, then, are you? You are the spiritual expression of God. You are the visibility of the invisible. You are the place where the infinite individualizes itself, not as a separate being, but as an embodiment of the one life, the one love, the one intelligence. This is the meaning behind the words, I and the Father are one, not two beings in harmony, not a human in communication with a distant deity, but one, life expressed in infinite form. As this realization begins to unfold, you no longer see yourself as a seeker of truth. You recognize yourself as the expression of truth. You no longer try to attain God. You understand that God is the very essence of your being. You no longer attempt to bring God into your experience. You perceive that your experience is the unfolding of God. This shift in identity is not philosophical. It is not a matter of affirming I am divine. It is an inner awakening, a dawning awareness that your life is sourced in something greater than the personal sense of self. It is the realization that the qualities of God, love, peace, abundance, harmony, intelligence, are not gifts bestowed upon you, but the very nature of your being. And as this realization becomes more established, your actions change, not because you are trying to be spiritual, but because your actions arise from a different center. You find that compassion flows more freely, not as a moral effort, but as a natural expression of the love that you are. You discover that wisdom guides your decisions, not as a product of careful thinking, but as a quiet inner knowing. You find yourself acting with greater ease, greater clarity, greater grace. You no longer ask, what should I do? But rather, what is the activity of God expressing through me in this moment? And you discover that the answer reveals itself without strain. This is the emergence of the real identity. It comes not with pride or superiority, for there is no personal achievement in it. It comes with humility, with gentleness, with awe. For to realize that I and the Father are one is to understand that you are nothing of yourself and yet everything in God. It is to recognize that the personal self has no power, no presence, no life of its own, and that all that you are is the manifestation of the infinite. When one touches this truth, even lightly, life becomes an unfolding rather than a struggle. The need to control fades. The need to justify oneself disappears. The need to defend, to compare, to compete, to grasp, all of it falls away. For the self that emerges is already whole, already complete, already one with its source. This is the culmination of living from the finished kingdom, the revelation of the self that has always existed in God, untouched by time, free from fear, radiant in truth. And now, as we bring this period of contemplation to its close, let us once more turn our attention inward, not to seek, not to strive, not to achieve, but simply to abide in the awareness that the spiritual work is finished. Whatever the mind may believe, whatever the senses may report, whatever appearances may arise, the truth remains untouched. God's creation stands complete, and you live in that completeness. You see, all that we have explored together in this hour leads to a single, gentle invitation. Rest. Not the rest of inactivity, but the rest of trust. The rest that comes when we no longer attempt to carry the burden of life upon our personal shoulders. The rest that comes when we release our belief in personal responsibility for spiritual attainment. The rest that comes when we understand that God is the life, the mind, the substance, and the law of our being, and therefore nothing can be added and nothing can be taken away. The practice from this moment forward is not to remember every word you have heard, nor to analyze the principles discussed. The practice is simply to return again and again to the awareness of the presence, to pause long enough in the midst of your day to recognize where I stand, God is, to acknowledge, even if only inwardly, I need not fear appearances, for they have no power. The reality of God alone is power, to rest in the truth. Whatever is necessary for this moment is already present in the invisible, awaiting my recognition. As you cultivate this inner atmosphere, you will discover that life becomes more harmonious, not because you have learned new methods, but because you have ceased interfering with the divine unfoldment. You will find that challenges dissolve more quickly, not because you have gained greater control over circumstances, but because you have surrendered control altogether. You will notice that peace becomes your natural state, because you have ceased identifying with the personal sense of self and have begun to live from the consciousness of the Christ. There may be times when you forget. There may be moments when fear reappears, when old patterns seem to return. Do not be troubled by this. Simply recognize that nothing has changed in God's reality. The finished kingdom has not wavered because your attention briefly shifted. Gently return to the truth. Gently return to the silence. Gently return to the awareness that the presence is here, now, complete. Remember always, you are not striving toward God. You are awakening to God. You are not trying to bring perfection into your life. You are learning to see the perfection that is already present. You are not walking toward a distant truth. You are allowing truth to rise within your consciousness. And so, as we leave this time together, let us rest not in words, not in concepts, but in the assurance that the same Spirit which lived as Jesus Christ, the same Spirit that revealed to him the truth of the finished work, lives also as you. It is not your personal wisdom that guides you, but the infinite intelligence that expresses itself through all creation. It is not your personal love that sustains you, but the love of God made visible as your life. It is not your personal strength that carries you, but the strength of the eternal that requires no effort. Let this be your assurance. The kingdom is finished. The work is finished. The truth is finished. And you, being the expression of God, are included in that finished, perfect, eternal expression. Rest in that. Trust in that. Live from that. For this is the secret Jesus revealed. This is the essence of Christ consciousness. This is the infinite way.